Hey, thanks for joining me today for episode 55 of Podcasting Your Brand. I'm your host, producer Jaime, providing learning lessons for you to podcast your brand. And today I'm going to share a Podcasting 102 topic, taking your solo episodes up a notch. This episode is brought to you by my own brand, Flintstone Media. Listen in and let's do this. Welcome to the final episode, at least for now, where I'm specifically focusing with you on solo content. And here's the thing. Even if you have a guested show, lean into this episode for a couple of reasons. You may find an idea that presents a good opportunity to add solo content into what you're already doing, or you may be inspired with an idea for some other future show altogether. So first, a brief note on something I want you to keep in mind as you're listening along today. On the last episode, I talked to you about how important it is for you to avoid making your solo content all about you, but I mentioned that you shouldn't be afraid to use stories of your own, both the wins and the losses. But why would I recommend that? First of all, remember that not making an episode all about you means that the value that the episode brings should remain focused on what your listener needs. But sharing your own stories as the examples that you use to illustrate your lessons is a great idea, and you should do that as often as possible. Why? Because it showcases your vast expertise and experience in the field. But there's a second, almost more important lesson that I don't want you to gloss over, okay? You really shouldn't be afraid to share your losses too. Why, producer Jaime? Why do I want to reveal when I've gotten things wrong? Great question. Because your losses legitimize your journey. I mean, think about it with you. Don't you appreciate it when I tell you when I've messed up, when I've learned my lesson from something that I did wrong? Oh my goodness. As much as your listener wants to aspire to achieve what you've achieved and to know what you've grown to know or whatever it is, your listener also wants to relate to you. And your losses make you a whole and real human. And any way that you can have your listener feel good while listening to your show, the better. And the reason I think that this may even be more important than sharing all those wins and milestones and the great tips and is because of that age-old podcasting mantra. People come for the content, but they stay for the host. And if they know that you as the host, you are a squishy, fallible, complex, and interesting human who understands the trials of the journey that they are themselves on, they will come back to you again and again. Okay, so how can you actually level up your solo content? Let's talk about the various types of solo content that you can present on your show. On episode 53, I covered creating a structure for your solo episodes. So whether you have a show that is fully solo content, or if you have a guested show, think of how you can add one or more of these ideas as a segment on your show. Perhaps after the guest interview, or instead as a part of the intro of your episode. First up, a tip segment. You can add a segment at the end that presents a deeper look at a key takeaway from your guest interview. Or you can share a practical tip that your listener can apply or a call to action that they can take that is related to that key takeaway. So that's a tip segment. Another option is to add an industry news segment. I've seen these work really, really well as both a front-loaded segment and a back-loaded segment. But when it's a front-loaded segment, you most likely want to keep it brief so you can get more quickly to your guest interview. However, if you feel like your audience would expect a more in-depth update, they may be better served if you give them that as a more robust segment, but consider carefully whether that should come in front of the guest interview or behind it. What are they there to hear the most? If it's the guest interview, then lead with that. If it's the industry news, if that's the key component of your show's value, then you can try leading with that. Another solo content idea is to have a history segment where you present a story of a historical figure or event. You can even do an on this day or on this week in history and share something significant, interesting, or useful from that time, but in a past year. So for example, if you're podcasting about the food industry, you can share a This Week in Hot Dog History segment when your episode drops on the anniversary week of the first hot dog eating contest or something like that, right? So that's just an idea. You get where I'm going. So that's a history segment. Now, a history segment obviously can be something very silly, like a hot dog eating contest, or something more serious, depending on your show. And similar to a history segment, you can also share a fun fact segment. That fun fact, it can be something pulled from history, or it can be something otherwise statistically or factually interesting. So a fun fact for a Chicago-based real estate show, wink, wink, hint, hint. I have a couple of clients who do Chicago-based real estate shows. Shout out to Straight Up Chicago Investor and Records in Real Estate. Okay, but anyways, so a fun fact for a Chicago-based real estate show could be about who a particular park was named after. Or a fun fact for a show about space exploration. Don't have one of those on the roster yet, but maybe one day. A fun fact for a show about space exploration could be about some of the amazing everyday items that were initially invented by NASA for space exploration. Now, spoiler alert, I might be about to give you a sad because despite urban legend, Velcro is not on the list. But the list of NASA inventions is actually a pretty cool list. So you should Google it. But as a final example for a fun fact, you could share something that has nothing to do with your subject matter whatsoever, but it's a fun topic for you to regularly share, and your listeners grow to love it because it's you, right? The mantra, come for the content, stay for the host. So as an example, back when I was the producer for the daily podcast, Horses in the Morning, I was charged with preparing what we called the On Today's Show, where towards the front of the episode, I'd say, on today's show, we have guest so-and-so talking about this and that. And then we have blah, 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 and just give like a rundown of what was coming up, an agenda for the episode. And I would always end it with, and that's what we have coming up on today's show. And speaking of today, did you know that today is ... And I would talk about whatever random day that day was. I would look it up on some website that had those random things like National Chocolate Day or National Play Checkers with a Neighbor Day. I don't think that's the thing. I'm pretty sure I'm making that one up, but whatever. I would say it. And then I would suggest some silly thing that the listener, should do that day to celebrate that random day. And it was completely silly. It rarely related to horses. It oftentimes made no sense. And the listeners loved it. So taking that as a solo segment concept, you could do something like that based on your episode's release date. So when you see your release date is coming up, go into Google, find out what random national day of whatever it is, and do something like that. So anyways, there are a lot of options, as you can see, for fun fact segments. And similar to a fun fact segment, continuing along down the spectrum here, you can opt for sharing a trivia segment. And this can be done a few different ways. You can present the background and question on one episode and then reveal the answer on the following episode. Or you can do both in the same episode. So you can present the question and then break to an ad and reveal the answer on the other side of the sponsor. Or you can present the question before the guest interview and then reveal the answer after the guest interview as part of closing out that episode. And actually, that can be a great strategy to employ for getting people to listen all the way through your episodes. But I digress because I can go on my tangents. And you can also flip this structure into a monetization strategy. But I digress again, holding back my reins, my goodness, because I'll be taking deeper dives into how trivia segments can be used to have people consume more of your content, and also how you can monetize a trivia segment. So that's all something to look forward to on future episodes for sure. So I'm holding back. I'm keeping things within scope per the theme of the last episode. And these last two ideas that I'm going to share for you today, these last two are only to be done if you are really confident that you won't dip into making your episode all about you. It takes practice to present self-focused content that doesn't come across as self-centered and still provides value geared and focused on your listener. But the first of my last two ideas here for you today is to share a story of your own that relates to the content of the episode. So rather than sprinkling an example from your own journey here and there, or rather than relating a whole bunch of stories in conversation with your guest, you can purposely set aside time, likely then toward the end of the episode after you close out the guest conversation, where you share your own story. So for example, if you have a show about weight loss, then after your guest interview is over, have an additional solo segment that shares a short story of your own that relates to your guest's journey or relates to the main takeaway from the conversation. Just make sure that your story continues to add value to your listener. So, for example, if I had a weight loss show, and if my guest related a story of managing your fitness through an injury, I'm having flashbacks. I could then share in short form my story of being so dang on close to hitting my weight loss goal. This is years and years and years ago. So dang on close. And then breaking my stupid toe. Seriously, it's a true story. And it was kind of crazy because I had to reset my own broken bone, but that's not what you're here to hear. I don't want to gross you out, so I'll stop to give all those details. But sharing that story of my own, of getting through that fitness bump in the road of a broken bone and pushing through on my journey, sharing that story of my own would give my listener another perspective and experience to pull from. So it's a self-focused story, but not self-centered, because the value, I'm still focusing it on my listener. I'm relating the value to something that can still be a learning lesson for them. And my last idea for you today, just again, be careful not to make it all about you. But my last solo content idea for you today is an update on your brand, your business, or yourself. Now, this is a funny one. And it really only works if you will have the kind of relationship with your listener that welcomes this in. And it's very nuanced and case by case. With my very first show from 2014, Curve the Cube, a guested show, I discovered over time that my listeners were really dialing into my journey as an entrepreneur as it unfolded over the course of that show. So while I also ended up adding a kind of tip segment as solo content at the end, I also started opening up more about my journey as an entrepreneur and a podcaster, sharing brief little updates within my show opener. But I don't think that would have worked, honestly, on episode 1. I think it had to be what it was, which was a responsive decision. So you're just going to have to be honest with yourself as to whether your listeners are interested in updates about you, your brand, and or your business, and then try to present those updates in a way that provides additional value to them. Opening the door on my own entrepreneurial journey and lessons learned was very valuable to my listeners on Curve the Cube because I shared my stumbles, I shared my rising aboves, I shared my looking forward tos, and I shared my updates. It was the good, the bad, and the ugly. So it was very relatable and valuable to my listeners. Okay, to recap, those ideas I just listed out for you included a tip segment, an industry news segment, a history segment, a fun fact segment, a trivia segment, a story of your own that relates, and an update on your brand, business, or yourself. So if you have other types of solo content that you produce and would love to share it with the show, let me know. Just share it with me on Instagram or email it to me at Jaime, Jaime, at flintstonemedia.com. I'd love to share your ideas with the whole community of listeners, and we'll give you credit and your show exposure. And another thing I want you to keep in mind as you're thinking through all these different possibilities is that there's a lot of blending that can happen between these ideas. So as an example of one way that I mean this, you can have a historical story segment on one episode, but then on the next episode, it becomes a trivia segment where you pose a question to your audience about the history segment on the previous episode. So there's that continuity there. And as an example of another way that I mean this, that you can blend ideas, is that you can have an industry news segment that then also presents a tip from you on how to move in reaction to that industry news. So there's lots of different ways that you can approach this. And also, I talked about these ideas as segments, but keep in mind that you can adapt these ideas and then adopt them in other ways. So for example, you can take the idea for the industry news segment, and if you release weekly, you can turn your final episode of the month into an industry news episode in full. And that would actually accomplish two things for you. It would take the pressure off of you once a month for finding a guest, and it would also concentrate your effort in finding and resourcing that news update into a single episode effort. So that's one way that you can do it. Another idea that I've seen done really, really well is to once in a while create a best of type of episode out of these solo segments. So if you have a solo segment at the end that gives a tip related to your guest story, then at the end of the year, you can collect the best of those tips and present them together in a single episode, recording filler audio on why that tip made your best of list for the year and taking that tip then to the next level in that new episode. So the sky's the limit when it comes to how to incorporate solo content into your podcast. And you should experiment. See what works for you and your audience and have a lot of fun doing it. And to close us out today, I want to share a few thoughts on capitalizing the most out of your solo content. On episode 53, I talked about some of the great reasons why you want to have solo content as at least part of your overall content offering. But to take that a step further, I want you to think of your solo content as an ever-growing portfolio of your brain. And that can be done in both directions. You can use your show as a platform to showcase your content from other things you're doing, or you can use content from your show in other things you're doing. So for the first one, you can use your podcast as a platform to showcase other things that you've done. In fact, the final episode on this show's feed, before I transitioned this podcast from my entrepreneurial focused show, Business in the Bedroom, to my podcast focused show, Podcasting Your Brand, was episode 31. And it came right on the heels of my having been asked to deliver a keynote address for Palm Beach County School District's Entrepreneur Day. So in preparation for that presentation, I reached out to the organizers and asked if they would mind if I capture the audio for my podcast. And they were totally cool with it. So I did. I hit record while I was presenting. My presentation was called Igniting Your Voice, the Business of Podcasting. And so I repurposed that recording of my presentation as solo content for episode 31 of my podcast. Boom. So I'll include links in the show notes to both my presentation and to the episode where I repurposed it, episode 31. Another way of using stuff that you're already doing as content for your show is what I did on episode 32. I've been a guest on several other podcasts, and a lot of that content served as great introductory content for this show as a transition. So I reached out to the host who had me on as a guest and asked permission to use those clips on my show. And they all said yes. So the very first episode of this show on this feed, my trailer episode, episode 32, was exactly that. It was a mashup of my own solo content, but pulled from me as a guest on other shows. So I could go on, but the idea is to keep your eyes and ears open for ways that you can bring content from stuff you are already doing to be solo content on your show. But this relationship between your podcast and all the other things you're doing can also go the other way around. And so you can use content from your show in other things. Save clips from as much of your solo content as possible as you produce it along the way. So from each episode, if there's a key clip with a great idea, a great tip, whatever, pull it and save it. Create a bank for these clips. Then use these clips to show off your brain. You can use them as sample clips on your website. Just put them right there. Clips that share your ideas while also showing off your personality. And you can also create sizzle reels for self-promotion. Now, I went into sizzle reels on episode 48, so I'll spare you that here. I'll instead just include a link to that in the show notes in case you need it as a refresher. But that's another thing you can do. You can create a sizzle reel for self-promotion. Bottom line is, regardless, even if you don't have an idea of what you're going to use it for, start today. Create a bank of clips of really great moments you've had as part of your solo content. So there you have it. Lots of ideas for you to experiment with to take your solo episodes up a notch. And have you heard me mention the Owl app yet? Of course you have, but be sure to download it today so you can be monetizing your expertise. Let people pick your brain on the Owl app, spelled with 2 W's and 2 L's, after they've first picked their payment method. Sign up with my referral code PL954123 and get your $10 credit. Then catch me on there for your very own one-on-one on-demand podcast coaching session. And be sure to subscribe to one of my other shows, the new Owl podcast, which we're doing in conjunction with the Owl app. I'm really proud that I get to co-host it with the founder himself, Jason Hill. And on that podcast, we're welcoming the experts from the Owl app who are masters of their fields to come and explore the power of connection in developing your expertise. All of this stuff that I'm putting down here on this show, a lot of that growth has come from my mentors, from my peers, and many, many other connections over the years. So listen into the Owl podcast to connect, learn, and grow. And up next on episode 56, I'll switch us back to the very basics of podcasting with deciding on a show name. And believe it or not, even if you've already launched your podcast, you can still change your name. Dun, dun, dun. So this next episode is worth listening to, even if you've already launched, so you can see if you've checked off all the important considerations with your show's name. So if you're not subscribed yet, be sure you do. And in the meantime, I have a whole host of free tips for you on my website. Just check out flintstonemedia.com/free tips. Thanks for tuning in to Podcasting Your Brand. In this chapter of the show, I'm revealing how you can harness the power of podcasting to expand your brand. So come and pick up what I've been putting down since 2014. Avoid common mistakes to propel your podcasting and branding forward. And if you have questions or are interested in becoming a sponsoring brand of this show, don't be shy. Reach out to me at Jaime, spelled Jaime, at flintstonemedia.com. It's producer Jaime signing off for now. Remember, the only thing more powerful than your voice is your spirit to use it. So turn that mic on.